Hello Seawolves and welcome back to the second Q&A Seawolf show of this Vendeeglobe, or should I say Vendeeglobe around the world race. Of course, many of you have been texting me, what's going on with Sebastien Simon, what's going on with Sebastien Simon. Yesterday, more or less, the minute that we ended the show was flooded with messages that he obviously broke one of his foils. We'll get into all that in a minute. Lots of other things going on, but before we do all of that, it is important that we first get to perhaps the most important thing of the entire show. I don't have my official Seawolf mug today because I have this very interesting mug from Reykjavik, actually, Iceland. So, hello Iceland. I hope you guys are ready. Here we go. 3, 2, 1. Cheers!
Alors là, je crois que c'est la première fois que je vois un arc-en-ciel aussi lumineux et parfait. Trop beau, regardez. Incroyable. Magnifique.
Yeah, and cool by the way that so many of you have been posting in the comments, what is this music that I hear when we're watching the rainbows? It's so beautiful and orchestral and everything. It is very nice, huh? So I put a link to that below in the comments if you want to download. It's actually not that much longer than what you hear. It's kind of a short fragment that kind of is meant to loop. But you can really enjoy it that way at home also if you like. Okay, now before we get to the questions, because that's going to be a long session again, lots of questions, very interesting questions to get to today, but we're going to do the tactical analysis then first and a little bit what is going on in the fleet before we get to the questions. So, well, let's start actually with the Sebastien Simon situation. So yesterday, right after the show, we got the message that Sebastien was sailing along nicely. Now, you've seen the video of how violent it was, yesterday and the day before. You can take a quick look. Every episode since Charlie Dalin and Sebastien kind of made the decision to go on a more riskier route, that there is some risk associated with that, and I was really hoping that it wouldn't result in some kind of catastrophic damage, which now it has, right? So in some sense, there's a very easy way to relate to each other, right? It's very confused seas that they've been going through for several days now, very strong winds. We mentioned yesterday that Sebastien actually did 7 jibes in one span of about 7 hours yesterday, which is also very trying on the boat in confusing seas, extending, retracting the foils. It's a lot of operations. So both of the gents in front put themselves through a lot of hardships, and also the boat through a lot of hardships. So in that sense, it is unfortunate, but also not entirely a mystery why this happened, because the boat just got overpowered, right? Now, we don't know if he actually hit something in the water or that it's just kind of stress failure. There's no real news on it as far as the pictures of the breakage. That really isn't conclusive, so it could have gone either way. And Sebastien himself also doesn't know, because he told us that he was sailing along, sort of trying to sleep at the moment. It happened in the night with his earbuds in. So he had, of course they still hear something with earbuds in, but he didn't have full hearing. So if there was like an extra hard tug or snap or anything like that, he didn't hear that. But the boat suddenly broached and went very much on its side, because when the carrying foil suddenly falls away, the carrying foil also is kind of one of the main elements now in the foiling boat designs, especially for the riding moments. So The non-foiling boats have a lot more water ballast to bring the boat kind of back up, to keep the boat straight, in combination with the keel and the sails and the other weight that they use to keep the boat from heeling over, you know, too much. But the foiling boats, especially the later design foiling boats that aren't modified, but they were really designed for foiling with the foils included, they have been designed with much less water ballast, especially because they just don't need it, because the foil has kind of its natural balance point, and so it kind of ensures that the boat doesn't heel over too much, because there's always the foil to kind of stop that heeling over. So when the foil suddenly falls away, then the boat heels over like way too much, and that's why you get a broach, which is basically the boat, you know, turning its nose full into the wind and kind of stopping and heeling over, and having the sail kind of blown straight with the wind, you know, heeling the boat over maximally. Almost in his case, I don't know like how his weight was dispersed at the moment when it happens, but with his design, he would have probably been pretty close to actually tipping the boat over, maybe even with the mast in the water, because that's how important the foil is for those more later design foiling boats that have it really in the design as a necessity to keep the boat kind of balanced. So I guess there was a lot of confusion. Now he was able to kind of sort the boat out again, and he is able to sail the boat without the foil, similar a bit to what Alex Thompson of course did in his first run with foils, when he also broke one of his foils and ended up being second in the race with only one foil, because he was so far ahead in first position that he actually managed to kind of almost hold on to his lead. Was overtaken of course and ended second place, but still it's possible to do it. On the one side where he still has the foil, the boat is more or less unchanged, so he can just use it the same way he was doing it before, doing incredible speeds like he was doing before, though perhaps a bit more careful now this time. But of course on the other side, because the ship is now out of balance, so one of the essential design elements that was just there for balancing, you know, all of the design, all the factors together, the water ballast, the internal weight, the sort of the shape of the boat itself, and the pressure of the sails and all that, he just doesn't have the original balance anymore. So that means that in strong winds, especially in stronger situations, he probably won't have any choice other than to reduce sail earlier, because in essence his ship is now in such a condition that he just won't be able to put as much pressure on that side anymore without heeling the boat over too much, maybe even putting it in danger of, you know, falling over or broaching again. So the only way really to still sail on that side as fast as possible is to find a new balance where he just cannot put the original maximum load anymore on the sails, and he will have to kind of find a new natural point, I guess, just through experimenting with that, maybe taking like one extra reef or like a reef and a half extra or something like that. He'll have to just kind of figure it out. It's an unprecedented situation where he knows that especially in strong winds, that will kind of be his new maximum, and it's very likely that it will be significantly less. So the current estimate now from Sebastien himself is that on the side where he's missing the foil, if he's sailing on that tack, he will miss roughly 30%, so 30% of the overall performance of the boat. So, you know, that's a pretty significant thing. Of course, you know, statistically he'll spend about half of the race on that particular side, so it's a 30% decrease in potential speed for about half of the race still to run. Now there are some parts of the race that are generally much more reliant on the one foil than the other, and that's especially the Southern Ocean part. So in that sense he's lucky that we're not halfway, but we're about, let's say, 40% into the Southern Ocean stretch, right? So it is lucky that at least he's in a very good position and he still has the other side he can foil on fully. So, you know, he's not a completely bird with clipped wings, let's say. On the one side he can still be super competitive. So it's going to be a race of winning on the one side and then losing quite significantly, especially compared to the other foilers behind him. So Jeremy Beyou, Thomas Rouillant, etc., who are all like hot on their heels. So it's very unlikely they'll be able to keep them off. Jan Michel, etc. But on the other hand, if he can stay on that right foil and gets a bit lucky with the wind, then he could still, you know, maintain much of his position for a good long time. So that's kind of the situation there. There were also several batten breakages, a lot of other like small damages, that, like I mentioned before, this is just something that we're going to be seeing now as we're just in the, very violent situation in the Southern Ocean now. So Charlie d'Olonne kind of nicely extending, well, not really extending his lead compared to Sebastien. So he had actually gained some miles on Charlie, not so much because of super fast sailing, but more because of slow sailing on Charlie's part. So now he's in better wind, but before he was doing kind of 15, 16 knots for a while because the wind was a bit less. But now I think he's gaining some distance again. He's doing about 2 knots faster than Sebastien right now, who's doing 20 knots, because right now at least he's on his good foil. And also Johan Richoum and Thomas Rouillant both gained quite a bit on Charlie d'Olonne especially again, and I guess Sebastien also automatically. So the total distance between Charlie and Johan in third was about 500 nautical miles, almost at the maximum point. Now it's about 350. So both of the gents, so both Johan and Thomas Rouillant, won about 150 miles or so back on Thomas because they were, or on Charlie d'Olonne, sorry, because he was just a bit slow. And well, for now they all seem pretty fast, although Thomas Rouillant a little bit slower. He's now in a little bit less wind, so he's doing 18 knots compared to all 3 other gents basically doing around 20. But I have to say Charlie is doing 21.6, so he's actually gaining a little bit of distance again on in his lead. And as you can see here on the map, very close to the Cape Le wind point now. So I think actually during the live show today, probably he's going to have just crossed the point, and so then he's literally into kind of the next phase heading towards Tasmania and New Zealand and really the halfway point. So another major milestone, and maybe in the chat while we're watching this we can see if he actually made it to the record, so that he's once again the fastest boat in this Vendeeglobe to get actually to Cape Lynn overall in the race. I guess we'll see. Other than that, yeah, kind of similar to yesterday, not that much crazy things going on. The second foiler group all doing really good speeds basically, in quite strong winds, and there was a lot of, there was an interview with Jeremy especially, talking about the last few days and him explaining that yeah, the seas are very violent, very confused, and the stress on the boat is enormous. So you often on the tracker see that the boats are doing maybe good speeds, 18, 19, 20 knots, and then slowing down quite significantly to, for example, 6 or 7 or even 9 knots. I think even here in the group you see a few of them. Yeah, so you see Nicholas Lundgren, for example, now doing 9 knots. That's and Jeremy doing 13. And probably in an hour, if you look at the tracker, they're going to be doing 20 again. And that's kind of an artifact of the seas just being very confused, which means that you have waves going in different directions at the same time. So it's possible for, you know, a body of water to have waves kind of sort of streaking in one direction, but simultaneously streaking in another direction. And so instead of when you have a sea that's kind of waving in one direction, when the wind has been steady in one direction for a while, then the movement of the boat, even though it can be a little bit chaotic, is relatively steady, let's say, because the waves are an equal distance apart, they're kind of equally high, and they're kind of in a line pattern, let's say. So it's kind of a steady movement over them all the time. But when you have confused seas, that means that there's another line of waves moving through, and you get these seas that are kind of going in every direction at the same time, which means instead of kind of a steady arc that the boat takes, you get this like very random sort of like movement when waves are crashing from different directions. And this is especially in strong winds, which what many of the guys now having, you know, 26, 30 knots, 35 knots in the gust, sometimes 40 knots. Can create very abrupt, you know, sort of jerks and bouts of the boat sort of being suddenly pulled in kind of unexpected directions. So it's tough on the skippers, because when you're in a relatively steady pattern, you actually get used to it, and when you're moving around, you can kind of jump from one handle to the other, and the brain adapts. You just kind of get used to a steady movement pretty quickly. But in confused seas especially, there's always this danger of the boat sort of making a lot of very unpredictable jerks. And so it also takes a lot of mental and physical energy if you're moving around, because it's very hard to anticipate the moves of the boat, because it's, yeah, almost like as random as it can be. So you're like going up a wave and then suddenly you're going to the side, and it's just like very, very tiring. And similarly for the material, it means that it's just getting a lot of different pressure and movement from different directions all the time, and it's especially those kind of cross-directional stresses where the boat is being thrown forward and then suddenly back and then suddenly to the right and then up. That always happens, but when it's especially random, it's especially bad on joints and on, you know, all the stuff that's glued together or screwed together, because those type of vibrations are especially good at kind of knocking stuff loose. So it's a very trying, very damaging ride for them so far, and more or less everybody in that whole area, so kind of Johan Richoum up to Clarice Kramer, they're all kind of dealing with this.
Hello, hello. We are on board Holcim PRB. Everything is going well. We had quite a tough night with a very strong wind and very short and bad sea state. We had up to 40-45 knots of wind due to a very kind of small secondary low, but very small system developing just on us almost. So it was a bit tough with very sharp waves. And now we are back with much better wind, like we have 25 knots of wind speed from northwest. So we are sailing downwind. The sea state is still a bit bad, but in the next few hours the sea state will supposed to be much better. We are sailing, so we are the black boat here, towards Cap des Wines. We will be there, I think, in 2 days. So we are going to sail full downwind for a bit, up to something like Tasmania Island. So we will probably be in Tasmania, south of Tasmania, in 4 or 5 days or something like that. Yeah, everything is going well. Now the boat is doing good. We are still very close, just behind Jérémy Beyou, Charal. So for I think the last 2 weeks or maybe 3 weeks now, I don't know, we are very close each other. It's a bit funny. We also have a group of boats with Sam Goodchild, Paul Meyer and Yannick Bestaven, not far away behind us. So I hope we'll be able to gain a bit on them, but not sure. I think they are quite close.
But especially the first and second group of foilers, so all the way up to Yannick Besthaven, they've been dealing with this for 5 or so days now. And so it's been an especially tough race so far, like more extraordinarily tough as far as the weather and the sea state goes, as we've seen in the previous edition, for example. So yeah, that's kind of it for the beginning of the fleet. Well, then we see Jean Le Cam. Fun to see that he has so many fans, especially the people that have watched the race like several times. Still extending his leading position on kind of the, let's call it the second fleet for now. So we have a lone holdout with Damien Seguin sort of on his own between the two fleets. But Jean in a commanding position, doing good speeds right now, 16 point something knots, with Isabel Joschke and Alan Rohrer hot on his heels. But I would say compared to yesterday, he's extended his lead again a little bit, mostly by the artifact of that he's moving very much in the right direction as far as course goes, while both Isabel Joschke and Alan Rohrer are a little bit going, well, they're not really going in the wrong direction, but they're kind of heading north, as you can see. So as far as the racetrack goes, they're not really on an optimal tack right now to gain positions. For the rest, everybody well beyond the point of the Cape of Good Hope now. And only Szabo really kind of lost in the back there. And yeah, that's it kind of for the tactical update of today. So now let's move into the questions. So, first of all, on the Conrad's topic, because I said we might have Conrad actually on the show today doing some of the questions and answers, but he's been in some very tough situations and weather so far, so no time for him yet to answer your questions, but he will hopefully be able to make some time for that somewhere during this week. So that's going to come maybe in another, like in a regular episode, we'll splice it in. Unfortunately, not today yet, but it is coming, so don't worry there. Then, the first of your questions. Now, I actually forgot the name of the person who asked this and I couldn't find the comment back, but someone asked, how are the sailors getting paid? Do they get a salary from the Vendeglobe race? And I had to laugh a little bit at this question, but I think it's kind of a fun and cool question because we have a lot of very seasoned sailors watching this show, and I really love actually that we also have some real beginners or people that are not familiar with sailing at all, who kind of ran into the channel on YouTube and are fascinated by the whole adventure and kind of the craziness of the race, who have kind of these type of questions. And I think it's also kind of makes sense that if you're not familiar with like sailing races or this type of like around the world adventure races in general, that it would seem reasonable that the sailors deserve a salary from the race, right? Unfortunately, it works a little bit differently. So I think that most people who are not familiar with sailing races probably think of it in an analogy that's sort of like Formula One, right? Where you have teams, Ferrari, Mercedes, etc. And those teams are kind of battling each other, right? And they have kind of a front man, which is the racer. We have Max Verstappen for Team Red Bull and all this type of things. And they're just kind of the team member that races the boat, right? But it's the teams that are really battling each other. And though that is to some extent definitely true, right? Every one of the skippers has a whole team behind them, and without that team, it is not possible to like do a race like this on your own. Like absolutely impossible to prepare a boat and do all that stuff. The structure is very different. So where in a Formula One race, it is really the team that would sort of like hire a skipper, let's say, hire like a coureur, like a pilot, to drive the car. In the Vendeglobe especially, it's the skippers that are driving the team. So it's really the skippers going head to head, and the skippers are kind of the directors of the team, right? Like they're also the team bosses for the most part, and so it's actually them paying everybody else, or at least it's their responsibility themselves to gain the money, the support, the sponsors, get the boat, get everything arranged. Ultimately, it's the skippers themselves that are responsible. Now, it differs greatly from team to team. So there are teams that are like super well funded, have major sponsors. And in some of those teams, you could say that the skippers maybe even themselves aren't completely in charge, because it's also maybe their sponsors that are like calling some of the shots or wanting things to happen in certain ways, right? So it's not exactly 100% like that. But pretty much all of the teams at least start with a skipper and not the other way around. So the skippers are not getting a salary. The Vendeglobe is not paying any of the skippers to do the race. In fact, you have to pay a fee to be in the Vendeglobe race yourself. And there are a lot of prerequisites. So in order to be able to race the Vendeglobe, because that's also one of the questions, like how do you get to race a Vendeglobe, you need to qualify, right? So for safety reasons, it's more or less possible you don't have to be a professional sailor to sign up to the Vendeglobe race. That's why we have adventure races and people who are essentially on their own gather like a small team and the funding and can do it. So there's no bar to entry in that sense. But you have to qualify. So there's a whole document that kind of shows all of the things that you have to do, which basically means that you have to gather a certain amount of ocean racing miles in your own IMOCA, which kind of shows and proves that you kind of have at least what it takes, that is very likely that you will survive the race and get your boat through it. And the IMOCA circuit, so that's several races, like they participate in the Fastnet, and there are like several different, like the Azimuth, there are several different races that the IMOCA class does in the 4 years towards every Vendeglobe. And so those are like training rounds. You don't have to participate in all of them necessarily, but the more of them you do, the easier it is to qualify, because you need a lot of miles, to cross several oceans, things like that. And so the whole pre-Vendeglobe circuit of 4 years is kind of purposely built by the IMOCA committee to make sure that everybody who in the end sort of gets ready in the final roundup to do the Vendeglobe is really qualified, right? They have what it takes. They're very likely to be finishing the race or doing very well, and any problem they meet on the way, they're very likely to be able to tackle it. And this year is actually the first year that it was topped at 40. So there were actually more than 40 boats who wanted to participate in the Vendeglobe, but they said no, 40. So they had actually a lottery with several earlier boats that kind of were guaranteed a place because they participated in early races or had like a top 10 place or things like that. But for the remaining part of the fleet, there was actually a lottery. And so there are also several captains who wanted to do the Vendeglobe, who were ready, had the funding, had a boat, etc., but who couldn't participate because they kind of capped the fleet at 40, because otherwise the fleet will just be too big and it will be kind of unmanageable, also from a security standpoint. So, very good question, Rosie, because kind of that's how it works. Then we had Rosie, and your last name, I'm definitely going to butcher that, so I just said Rosie from, I think, Finland, if I look at the name. And she asked, how do the weather systems like the doldrums and the St. Helena High, etc., stay in one place on the planet? Now, that's actually a very good and insightful question, and the answer to it is also rather interesting. So if you jump into the screen here with me, we kind of see the Earth, and you can see here the air kind of flowing over the planet. Now here's the interesting thing. So we humans are actually quite good at imagining fluids because we have water and, you know, syrups and oils and other things that we work with kind of on a daily basis. So we know how things flow, you know, from like the coffee in my cup here, if I swirl it, we have a good image of how fluids flow. And so when you look at this depiction of the Earth, where you can kind of see these flowing lines, you also see that it flows. Now the Earth is turning in this, well, actually in the opposite direction. So if we can look at the top of the planet, it rotates in a counterclockwise direction, right? So if we kind of imagine ourselves standing still in space, then the Earth is turning kind of like this, right? And so the way to think of what wind is doing, the air is flowing, is that the only reason that air flows around the Earth, that it's not steady, is because the Earth is turning around the sun, right? So if the Earth wasn't turning, the air wouldn't move also. Like it would move because we're moving, so it kind of swirls around your hands and things like that. But there wouldn't really be much wind at all, because it's the rotation of the Earth that is sort of like a spoon in a coffee cup, is kind of constantly swirling the Earth, right? And so because the Earth moves like this, you can kind of actually see that there are definite patterns. So you can kind of see a streak here, you can see kind of a streak here. If we go down to, for example, the St. Helena High is a good example, so you can kind of see it here. But you can see that it actually looks kind of like a streak coming off of the tip of South Africa, right? Now, why is that? Because if you have an object that's moving through a fluid, right? So if I have, let's say, a bath of water, and I move my hand like this through it, we all understand that's going to create sort of like a wave, right? And that's exactly what's happening with the ground and the air. So the fact that, if we take the St. Helena High for an example, the fact that the Earth is sort of moving like this, right? It's moving kind of from left to right in this picture. It means that the wind, which is, you know, it's not standing still because the Earth is moving always. But if you imagine that the air would be standing still and the Earth moves through it like there, what would happen is that the air from here is kind of getting like swept over South Africa, so it's kind of being pushed up, right? And then it sort of shrieks down from Africa again, sort of once it's kind of passes, right? And so what does it do? Well, it kind of brings air up and then, you know, pushes it on top of the air that's already there, behind there, and so you get high pressure, right? Because you get more air. It's like a mountain in the air, and that's because Africa has just kind of swirled underneath there, right? So that's why it's in one place, because the reason it's there is because Africa is there. And as long as the mountains and the Earth, all of that is there, that's going to always be creating this swirl there. So as long as the Earth rotates, all of the hills and mountains, if you take a look at this map, I'll put also the link in below where you guys can find it, you will see that every mountain, everything that kind of sticks out on the planet creates kind of a swirl of air, of high pressure behind it. And you can see it here kind of off the coast of India, you can see it here kind of behind the islands here, everywhere, behind Australia here. It's just kind of how air works, because it's just like water flowing over things. Then if we look at the Southern Ocean, for example, because that's also an interesting point to kind of watch. It seems that my mouse is out of battery here in the middle of the show. So you can see all the air kind of swirling around Antarctica. That's literally the wind that the race is using to get around the world, right? And so that's kind of our course, is we're kind of coming here down to South Africa, and then we're like going something that looks a bit, you know, the route looks a bit like this, and then like back to Europe again, right? Now, all these swirls, why are they happening? Well, basically, we're a sphere, right? And so the biggest amount of movement is around the equator, because the Earth is the biggest there, let's say, in the direction that it moves. So that's where the Earth is going very fast. But if you go down to the poles, the Earth is moving much less fast. Like, in essence, it's moving at the same speed, but it's kind of like if you're standing on if you have like a merry-go-round, if you stand in the middle, the turn doesn't seem so fast. If you stand at the end, you're going a lot faster, because the more you go away from the center, the faster you're moving. And so the air that's essentially in the middle of Antarctica, let's say, is hardly moving, right? It's kind of a still area, because that area is relatively not moving so much. While this area here is moving way faster, right? And so right in the middle of that, the air being relatively still and the air moving relatively fast, what happens? Well, it's like moving two fluids that are going at a different speed together. What's going to happen? Well, they're going to create swirls, right? And so that's why we get this boundary layer, because that's all it is. It's a boundary layer between air that's relatively still and air that's going relatively fast. And so that's the first kind of major factor in shaping all weather on the planet. It's just the fact that the Earth rotates. That's what's creating a lot of wind and the swirls in the wind, etc. That's one of the most major factor, I would say, except for one other, which I'll go into now. So that's kind of factor one. The second factor is, of course, the temperature, right? So if we go here at, I think we have temperature also here. Temperature, yeah. So you can see here very clearly that Earth definitely has kind of a temperature band, let's say, right? So we have the equator where the sun is closest and where everything is hot, and we have kind of the poles where it's much colder on both sides. And so we have the rotation of the Earth creating all these up and down swirls, as the Earth is kind of like a spoon, you know, swirling the wind all around the planet. But at the same time, we have this band kind of right across the center of the planet, which is heating up the air that is flowing there to a point much beyond kind of the rest of the planet. And so what essentially happens is that all of the air on the northern hemisphere, once it gets hot enough, compared to the colder air, wants to flow up. Just like hot coffee will go to the surface, or hot water in a bath will flow to the surface, and you know, hot air from your barbecue or whatever wants to go up. It's just what it does. And similarly, it does that also on the southern hemisphere, but then we have to kind of turn the Earth, you know, around. So if we look at the Earth the way the Australians look at the planet, like this, with Australia kind of on top, you know, you have maps of this. On this side, the hot air flows up also, right? So those two powers, so the hot air is flowing up, flowing down, respective on which hemisphere you're on, and we have the Earth rotating at the same time. Those are the two factors that are creating all the wind, all the weather on the planet. Those are the two main driving factors. And this is, for example, an interesting point that you never hear in the whole climate change discussion, is like, is the speed at which the Earth rotates completely steady, or does it change? Because if the rotation speed of the Earth changed even a little bit, you can imagine if I'm like stirring my coffee here at a steady speed, and I speed it up a little bit, relatively all the storms and all the wind speed on the whole Earth would temporarily increase, but then as they catch up to the speed again and kind of get to a new balance, it would be kind of the same again. If the Earth slows down, all the storms would increase for a while also and then become the same again. So the entire system is very much, it's a balance. It's like everything is relative in this particular system. And it's like if you have two surfaces that are moving kind of in opposite directions, it's kind of the same as if one was standing still and the other one was going twice as fast, or the other one is going still and this one is going twice as fast, would be the same, right? So two objects going at 5 kilometers like this is the same as one standing still and this one going 10 kilometers per hour. So that makes it very, very hard to pinpoint any one particular factor, as in like, is the distance to the sun exactly the same? Is the speed of rotation exactly the same? That's why, you know, for someone like me who actually understands many of these systems quite deeply, the whole discussion of like, well, what about CO2 or things like that is really rather dumb when you kind of try to reduce all of weather and things like that to like one factor and say, oh no, it's this one thing. It's like, no. There are like so many things going on and it's all relative compared to each other. And if one thing's changed, everything else will change. You get a new balance. And then if you change something else, everything will change and it'll get into a new balance again. So it's just completely impossible for anybody to really predict that in any long term. And that's why we always say weather predictions are good for like 2 days, maybe 3-ish, but by the 3rd day it's already almost completely unusable, and anything beyond 4 days is complete, no one knows. And that's true anywhere in the world, and it's also true for any climate models or anything like that that's trying to predict weather like hundreds or thousands of years from now. It's just bullshit. Yes? So that's the answer to that question. Let's look at the next one. So we have Roku, or @Roku, who asks, I have a question. How do they slow the boats down for maneuvers? It seems that with winds and sea stays that they are facing going into islands would be a bad option. I suppose they could have to, but it's a race and who wants to stop? Yeah, so there really is no way to slow the boats down, but for maneuvers, basically what they do is they either like turn up into the wind a little bit and loosen the sails, or they reduce the amount of sails quite drastically, right? So they can furl their head sails, they can like open or close their mainsail a little bit, and then use the direction that they're pointing in to reduce the relative wind speed. So if you're going into the wind, for example, and the boat is going 20 knots and the wind against you is also 20 knots, you're in a relative situation where you got 40 knots of wind. But if you steer with that wind for a little while, you can actually reduce the wind to almost nothing, because if you're going 20 knots with 20 knots that are following, your relative wind speed on board is suddenly going to go to almost zero, and now you have a much easier platform to work on. So it's always a bit of a give and take between how much space do they want to lose, right? What do they want to do? But there is no direct way to really instantly slow the boats down. So it is actually very hard, but most of it is done by reducing sail. So the head sail is usually the easiest thing, to just furl that. And that basically reduces the amount of sail that they have up by more than half, because mostly more than half of it is the square meters from the head sail and not from the mainsail. So that helps a lot to at least reduce the speed, and then they only have the direction that they're sailing in to reduce the relative wind speed again. And it's not about, it's all about reducing the relative wind speed on board in order to go on top and be able to, do some maneuvers or walk around and work on stuff. And that's really the only two tools that they have. We have Captain Ron. What do they use for rigging? Is it carbon? What do they do? So they're fully carbon rigs. So it's carbon stays basically, and they use Dyneema for all the lines. So sometimes it's an intermediate where some part will be Dyneema, sometimes some parts will be carbon, but that's what they do. And pretty much all of the lines on board are Dyneema, because the loads on these particular ships are so incredibly tough that basically Dyneema is the only way to do it safely. It's beyond what most of the more regular lines that are not Dyneema could take. Then, a very interesting question from Hans. You asked it several episodes. You really want to know this, huh? Is there any doping tests? Like, are the skippers allowed to, bring some cocaine on board or whatever if they want to keep themselves awake? And of course, this is completely banned. But I don't know if there's any like specific rule actually in the rule book that bans it, because it just would be bad sportsmanship. And if there's one thing in sailing races that I've seen everywhere, is that there is just great sportsmanship, and there's also a lot of reliance in the sailing world on sportsmanship. So yeah, there are no like official checks or anything like that. But yeah, it's not allowed to dope. And yeah, I also don't think that there is actually any substance on the planet that would really give you an edge long term, because you would have to, like, someone would have to be sort of high the entire race, right? Which also impairs like your reasoning and lots of other things. I live in Amsterdam, so you know I know about all this. And yeah, it's just not really possible. So I don't even think that there is any kind of doping or drug in existence that would be a good thing to take all throughout a race like the Vendee in order to give you some kind of edge. So it just wouldn't work. There is coffee, I guess, and some of the skippers do have coffee on board. So that's not illegal, and you know, coffee is in a sense a stimulant. So that's definitely something that all the skippers, I think, also drink on board. Then, could you explain how the cabin is constructed so no water gets in and potentially destroys the equipment? It is not true that the cabins are constructed in a way that no water comes in. It is definitely so that through the various hatches, doing maneuvers and stuff, that many of the cabins actually do get wet. You can also see it in the background that many of the cabins have this kind of plastics, even in very enclosed cockpits like what Johan Rishum has, for example. So there's always some water ingress. The solution is just to have very good dewatering systems. So the way that everything is angled inside, it generally funnels all the water to one place where they can either pump it out, or it naturally just flows out the back of the boat. Whenever it's pointed a little bit up, it just kind of dewaters everything. But they're not completely watertight. I think the most watertight one there is right now is Johan Rishom's boat, because it's one of the newest. And so his cockpit is kind of internally floating in the structure. So it's kind of the floor is a bit raised from the actual bottom of the boat. You know, it's painted a different color compared to like the more darker true interiors. So it's pretty watertight, but nothing is completely watertight. So even he has, if a big wave comes over, he has these hatches that he can sort of stick his head out of. And through those hatches, there's still water coming in. It's just that they made an arrangement so that it can only kind of flow one way for the most part, which keeps most of it back. And you will also see in many of the videos that whenever you see electronics mounted on the inside, they're almost always mounted on the ceiling. So they're kind of mounted inside and against the ceilings, or kind of on the backs of ceilings. You can see it in my video with Pip Hare, for example, where we look at the whole electronics build. And that's kind of the driest place, right? Because the ceilings are kind of the last place where water's going to get. So they just find kind of the least likely ceilings to be touched by water. And that's where they mount most of the important electronics, etc. That's kind of how they keep everything dry as much as possible. And then, how do the skippers do the drone footage? Well, they do that themselves. So on our show you can see lots of drone footage generally, and some of it is from pre-done drone footage. So before the race, all of the skippers did some drone, sometimes helicopter sessions where they were filmed, so that we have a lot of like cool footage to show, you know, during the race, to kind of show you guys what the boats look like when they're in full action. But here on the show, you're also seeing a lot of real drone footage, because many of the skippers have, you know, since learned how to fly their drone offshore. You can actually see in this drone footage, which is recent from Conrad, you can see him sitting in the boat with his drone goggles on while he is sailing, sort of controlling the drone. And that's what many of the skippers do. So it depends on circumstances. In very strong winds and stuff, they really don't have time or ability to do that. So when you see like very crazy drone footage in like big storms and stuff, that's usually stuff that's been shot previously by you know, drone pilots or even helicopters, because it would be very hard for them to drone while they're doing that. But also very regularly you will see drone shots that are actually of them flying through the Southern Ocean, which they've been taking themselves if the wind are like reasonable for them to actually launch a drone and film themselves. So that's how they do that. And then the final question for this session from New Kid, or at least that's your handle. Do you know why the displayed wind and also the wind forecast is so different between the official Vendeeglobe tracker and Windy? That's because they use different models. So even in Windy, you can switch between several models. So if I go to Windy here, if you look at my screen real quick. You can see that here on the right side of the screen, there are like, there's here ESCMF, UKF, GVS, Aladdin, Icon, and these are all different models. And so if I click those models, you'll see that the prediction changes all the time, and that's because some weather models are more local. So you see that this, for example, creates a bounding box where it doesn't go beyond because it's like a more local European model. ECMF is like a combination of a lot of local things into one worldwide model, but every model is different. And that goes again to what I mentioned before about like weather being notoriously hard to predict. Some models are like aimed at making very good short-term predictions. Other models are good for example, they're really focusing on making their predictions as accurate as possible for that 3 or 4 time frame window. There are other models that are like sort of, they're not good, they're not accurate at all, but they're kind of as accurate as you can be for like longer term predictions, like a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks. But the success rate again for those is very low, right? So it's like has like a 10% accuracy or something like that. So each weather model has a different focus, but it is really true for all weather models, including climate models, that anything that goes beyond 3 days is just utterly worthless. Because of like, if you really want to know why, study like things like chaos theory and chaos math and things like that, there's just a boundary. That's why we can't predict the future, right? Like climate models are a way of future predicting. And the reason why we can't predict the stock market in 3 years is the same reason why we can't predict the weather or the climate in 3 years, or why we can't predict like personal health in 3 years or whatever, because it's just not possible, right? So yeah, it's just a fact of life that we cannot predict the future in any field because the amount of variables is too large that we just cannot, we don't know the initial state, we don't have enough computer power to then take the initial state and get to the next state. It's just not possible. Yeah, that's why the models are different, because none of them are correct, right? So if you want to get a good estimate while you're at sea, what most skippers do is they take several models. That's also why you kind of see me going through several models, because when you look at lots of models, then you know that within the overlap somewhere there, if you look at all of them, you kind of have some idea of what could happen, right? You have a picture of like several different things that could happen. And then when you plan for several different eventualities, if you're open at sea and you thought, well, I could have like a nice day of sailing, or it could be pretty stormy. If it turns out to be pretty stormy, then at least you kind of got yourself ready for that would be a possibility, right? And that's kind of the best we can do. And yeah, so that's it for this question round. I left all of the questions that you guys made for Conrad on the Conrad list. So he has the questions. So when he gets to that, he'll get to it. And yeah, that's it for the show today. So hope again that you really enjoyed. Please let me know in the comments below your questions for the next show, or if I didn't get to it. And of course, please like and subscribe. And well, this episode is already again very long, so I hope it all works out with getting it out to you on time again today. And see you in 24 hours for the next update. Ciao, wolves!